So we're on Daf Samach Dalid, and we got up to Ella Omer Abzera, about 13 lines down from the top of the Amud. And Reb Zera says that Simonim lav da oraisa. So that in the issue of why we require that the Akum identify the bird from which these eggs came, and that bird is a kosher bird, why not just rely on the Simonim? Because we have ways of identifying the eggs and knowing whether or not they're kosher eggs. On that, Reb Zera answers that although we have simonim, but the Torah itself does not recognize those simonim as reliable because it could be that there are non-kosher birds that have similar eggs to the kosher birds. The ilo temahachi, Reb Zera proves his point. Ha the Omar of Asi, we had back on Daf Samach Beis a statement of Rav Asi, Shmones Sfekos Hein. There are 8 cases of birds that we don't know whether they're kosher birds or not kosher birds. And if you're going to tell me that the Torah relies on simonim, then why not take a look at the eggs of the birds, lived off with beitzim didhu, and then we'll be able to make an absolute determination as to whether or not the bird that hatched these eggs was a kosher bird. Shma el Shmamino, we see from this as simonim lav torais. The Torah doesn't rely on simonim. So therefore, simonim only gives us, let's call it a mixas raya, a partial indication that the eggs are kosher and they came from a kosher bird. Now we need to complete that raya and make it perfect. So we add another element into the equation, and that's the fact that the akum who sells us the eggs identifies the bird from which these eggs were born, and he's afraid to get caught in a lie because we can easily compare these eggs to the eggs of that kosher bird that he points to, and we'll see if there's any dissimilarity between the eggs. So then we know he's lying. So he doesn't want to get into that situation where we could verify that he's lying. But that itself, in and of itself, would not be sufficient. We need to know that we can verify him because there are simonim of eggs. So we take one, let's say it half plus half equals a whole. We have on the one hand the simonim, which the Torah does not rely on. We have the statement of the akum that these eggs came from a kosher bird, which we cannot rely on. But when we add the two together, the integration of A plus B gives us a reliability that we can rely on the fact that these eggs came from a kosher bird. Now, we have another problem here that we have to address, which is going to come up now in the Gemara, and that is when you have in the Brisa a list of simone kashrus of beitzim, that we can identify the eggs as being kosher eggs, meaning they came from a kosher bird. The Gemara wants to analyze now, what do we gain from these signs? And what was the purpose of having these simone beitzim? So we have one answer, possibly, that we need them as support for the akum when he claims that these are kosher eggs that he's selling us. But the Gemara wants to suggest that also will derive from the simonim that in certain cases, if the egg looks like this, as we'll soon see, then we know for sure that it's a non-kosher egg, meaning it came from a non-kosher bird. So Adam, maybe Usher would want to know where we're up to. I'm not sure, but anyway, we're halfway through Daf Samach Daled Amud Aleph, and you'll see a line that starts with the word Simonim about 18 lines down from the top. El Lamai Hilchasa Katani La. So what do we have? These signs of a kosher egg. Hachi Kama. And now we go through the Simonim. Shnei Rashehem Kadim. If you have a perfectly oval circle of an egg, or alternatively, Oshnei Rashe Chadim, or if the two ends of the egg come to a point, then we're going to know for sure that it's an egg from a non-kosher bird. Oh, or a third way of identifying that these eggs come from a non-kosher bird is chelmo mi bachutz v'achelbo mi bifnim. Right, in a kosher bird, the yolk is on the inside, and the white of the egg, which is called the albumen, is on the outside. But here you find that the yolk is on the outside and the albumen is on the inside. Vadai tmeya. Then ipso facto, you know that this egg came from a non-kosher bird. And that would mean that even if the akum would identify these eggs as having come from this bird that's a kosher bird, it wouldn't be worth a dime, because with these simoni tuma, we know for sure ipso facto that these eggs are non-kosher. However, Reisha Chad, if on the other hand, the egg on one side, on one end, comes to taper off, in other words, it's shaped a little bit like a V, Reisha Chad Kad, and Chad means on the other end, Kad means it's rounded, or in a case where chelbo mi bachutz v'chelmon mi bifnim, where the yolk is on the inside and the white on the outside, then we have simonim that this egg came from a kosher bird, but it's not reliable because, again, Reb Zera says simonim lavdo raisa. But the lecha, in addition to that, the guy identifies these birds shall of ploni, that they came from that bird, and that bird is tar, who is a kosher bird. Then we're going to add A plus B and smoch aleh. We can rely on the akum because the eggs have simone kashrus. However, bistama, if let's say the akum sells me eggs and he doesn't know where these eggs came from, and then all you have now to fall back on and rely upon is the simonim, is lo tismach aleh, then you cannot rely that these eggs are kosher eggs. Why? I mean, after all, they have simone kashrus, so even if the guy cannot identify the bird from which these eggs were hatched, nevertheless the eggs speak for themselves with simonim. The answer is the Torah doesn't rely on these simonim. The ika urva de dami liona. There are eggs from an orev. Orev, if you recall, was the archetypal non-kosher bird, which, whatever it is, a crow or a vulture, whatever it might be, they have eggs that are very similar to the eggs of a pigeon. And it means they have those phenomenon that are exhibited by the pigeon eggs, that it's round on one side and tapers off on the other side, and yet these are eggs from a non-kosher bird. They're eggs that came from an urva. And therefore, even though it's unlikely that these eggs came from an urva, and most likely they came from a pigeon, which is a kosher bird, nevertheless, the Torah is not going to rely on simanim that are not absolutely certain. And therefore, we have to be mashlim. We need the additional element of the akum telling us that these eggs came from the specific bird that he's pointing to, and we know that that bird is a kosher bird. Now, it would seem from this Gemara that even Reb Zera, who holds that the Torah doesn't rely on simanim, that's only because there's a possibility, albeit a far-fetched possibility, that the simanim, these signs, are not reliable. But the implication is that Rabbi Zera would concede that if the simanim were what we call muvhakim, a siman muvhak means it's like absolute, and this is relevant to the case of identifying a dead body, a corpse of a human being, and there are simanim that are not reliable. Let's say, for example, a married woman has to get a heter to marry another man because her husband died, and we need testimony that her husband died. And the Eidim testify that the body that we saw was short and not long. It was skinny and not broad, and so forth and so on. These are simanim that we don't rely on. But if, let's say, they can identify that under the left ear there was a certain specific kind of a tattoo that is rare and almost unheard of, and they can identify exactly where it is on the body, then it could be the Torah would rely on those simanim and allow her to get remarried. Omar Mar, getting back to the Brisa. The Brisa had a case which was very vague and we didn't understand. Chelbon v'chelmon me'uravim ze b'zabeduashu beitzas sheretz. That if you open up the egg and you find that the yolk and the white, or otherwise known as the albumin, are mixed together, then you know for sure that this is an egg of a sheretz. Now, a sheretz is a creeping creature that the Torah prohibits eating, and one who eats from a sheretz hashoretz al ha'oretz violates a lav d'oraisa, gets malchus arboim. However, in the case of someone who eats the contents of the egg of a sheretz, then it all depends upon how developed the embryo inside the egg is. And there are various factors that play a role and kick in order to determine at what stage the embryo is already considered developed. Now, let's keep in mind that in the case of an oaf, the Torah prohibits eating the embryo of an oaf. However, we should not identify that lav, that prohibition that applies to the embryo of an oaf, with that prohibition that applies to the embryo of a reptile, of a crawling, creeping creature. That two different lavim in the Torah. And in order to give malchus, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, the violator has had to receive a warning, an asra, and the asra is to tell him exactly which lav he violates in the Torah. So that when we talk about finding an embryo inside an egg, we want to know whether or not the embryo inside the egg in a very early developed stage belongs to an oaf or belongs to a sheretz hashoritz al haaretz. Because otherwise, we don't know whether the hasra that was given to the violator is a valid hasra. Did he mention the right lav in the Torah? Because there's one lav called lav hashoritz, sheretz hashoritz al haaretz, and there's another lav for oaf shebashamayim. And therefore, the Bryce wants to tell us that if we see that in this undeveloped embryo, there's chelmon v'chelba muravim zebazeh, then we can identify with all certainty that this embryo came from a crawling creature. Now, the problem with this whole sugya that we're about to learn is that there's certain reptiles, like, for example, snakes and lizards, which come under the lav of sheretz hashoritz ala oretz, creeping creatures, and yet there's no white to their eggs. It's purely yellow. It's purely yolk. So when we say here that because, there's also chelbon me'urav zeh b'zeh, and there's also chelmon me'urav zeh b'zeh, and the chelmon, so the chelmon exists in all sheretz hashoritz Allah, but the problem is with the chelmon, because in those cases that I mentioned before, like snakes, there's no distinct chelmon. So it could be that the brisa is referring specifically to other kinds of shrutzim, like turtles or crocodiles. These are shrutzim that do contain an albumin during the embryonic developed stage. Or it could be that even with regard to certain reptiles, like snakes and lizards, the proteins that are normally present in the albumin are now contained in the yolk itself, and that's called me'uravim zebus. Lamai hilchasa Omar Ukmar Omar of Ukva Bar Chama Lomar Sheim Rikma v'Nikva, that if the embryo reached that developed stage, that it's considered an embryo, like a vital being that generates an isolav in its achila. Not only that, but a sheretz is mitame, so that normally when you come in contact with an egg, that's not mitame. But if, let's say, you pierce through the egg and you come in contact with the embryo, the dead embryo inside the egg, then mitame kadasha, if that embryo has the small volume of a lentil, that's enough kadasha to be mitame. However, if it comes from a bird, then the embryo of a bird, and for that matter, the corpse of a bird, is not mitame. So therefore, when you're looking at these eggs that have undeveloped embryos, but they've developed to a certain point, that perhaps if it's the shear of a lentil and it came from a sheretz, it's mitame. So therefore, we have to know when you pierce with the, inside the egg and come in contact with this embryo, you have to know whether it's in the embryo of a sheretz or an embryo of an oaf. Nafkamina, whether or not you're tummy. Maskif lo ravina, not every sheretz conveys tuma. Dilma de nachashu. Maybe this egg containing an embryo is the egg of a snake. A snake is not mitame. There are only 8 categories of shrutzim, of creeping things, that convey tumah. That's called Shmona Shratz, and they are listed in the Torah itself. And a snake is not in the list. So therefore, even if the snake is producing an egg and the embryo is developed, and let's say there's yolk and albumin, and they're all mixed together, but nevertheless it would not convey tumah. Elam Rava now offers an alternative explanation as to why we have to know whether or not this is a sheretz of an oaf or the sheretz of a sheretz hashoretz ala oretz. Shem rikma ve'achola. We're not talking about a case where he touched the embryo inside the egg, but rather he swallowed the embryo inside the egg. And rikma means it's already a developed embryo, such that it has the status of the mother, and it is either kosher or not kosher. Now we have to know by looking at these eggs, and he had eaten the embryo inside the egg, was that an egg of a sheretz or is it an egg of an oaf? Loke oleh mishum sheretz hashoretz ala oaf. That if it has this phenomenon, that it's chelbon v'chelbon mu'uravim zebes, that we know therefore that it's the sheretz of a shoretz ala oretz, and therefore if he got the proper accurate hasra, namely don't eat this embryo because it's a sheretz hashoretz ala oretz, then he gets malchus. But if they would find the egg and it's chelbon and chelmon separated one from the other, which means that it's an egg from a bird, then if they warned him, don't eat this embryo because the sheretz hashoretz ala oretz, it's an invalid hasra, and that warning would not generate malchus. If that be the case, if we're talking about eating the embryo, then my area ditmeya. Who cares whether or not the egg comes from a kosher or a non-kosher mother? Afilu de Torah nami. Even if it came from a kosher mother, nevertheless, we have a ribui in the pasuk, which we'll see in just a minute, that even if the mother is kosher, for example, let's say we talk about a chick that's produced by a chicken, by a hen, I should say, then there's an isur da'oraisa if we eat the embryo of a chicken, even though the chicken is a kosher bird. This Tanya we learned in the Brisa kol, and we emphasize the extra word kol. Hasheretz hashoretz ala oretz, l'rabos efrochim, etc. So we'll get back to that in just a minute. But efrochim means that we're talking about chicks from a chicken, and if you eat that chick, you're going to violate an isur lav, even though the chicken, the hen itself, is a kosher bird.